Now, tonight there are growing and intensifying calls for the last remaining Fees Must Fall activist in jail to be released. Khanya Cekeshe has been in the Leeuwkop prison here in Johannesburg since December 2017, serving a 5-year sentence for public violence and malicious damage to property for an incident during a Fees Must Fall protest in 2016. This evening, some civil society organizations are saying that his sentence is unfair and unjust. Well, for more on this, joining us on the program, Matteo Brody, a researcher for Section 27. Welcome to you and thanks for joining us. Unfair and unjust. I'm assuming that you're joining that clarion call being made by a number of other people. Why is it unfair?
Thank you for having us, and good evening to your viewers. Look, I think the first thing that one ought to look at is the circumstances that happen around Khanya and this incident that leads him behind bars. The protest happened at a heightened stage, and we believe that Khanya should have received a less harsh sentence. You look at incidents of people that have been charged with the same charges that Khanya got charged with in the Western Cape, for instance, that weren't sentenced to time behind bars. And what they had rather was they could be sent to community service or counseling. And Khanya happens to be the only Fees Must Fall activist that's behind bars right now. And so we think there ought to have been greater understanding of what happened during the protest and greater leniency, and and that's why we think it is unjust.
Let me just get this right. You're not saying that he shouldn't have been punished, because a court found him guilty of public violence and malicious damage to property. The suggestion is 5 years was too much.
Yes.
In this particular case, and you would know about this in detail, what sort of sentence should he have been given?
Like I say, there's Fees Must Fall activists that were charged and were found guilty of exactly the same charges.
You said community service, but there's a suggestion that his crime was perhaps a little bit more serious.
Look, we don't condone violence, right? And so violence shouldn't have happened in the protest, but we are calling for greater understanding behind the conditions that were happening. This happens when campuses are militarized and there's general violence in these protests from both sides. And so we're saying...
What does greater understanding mean, and greater understanding by whom?
Greater understanding from the court side. One ought to look at alternative means. Khanya Cekeshe is a young man with a bright future ahead of him who was a student and happened to be caught in the heat of the moment, and this is what happened.
Was this a failure by the bench then, or was it, as has been suggested, the client was given, and I quote, poor legal advice by a legal aid lawyer? Which is it?
Precisely. So the whole process was unjust in our view. If you'll be aware that Khanya is appealing his conviction because he was given bad legal advice, bad legal representation in the initial case. And so he's appealing, the conviction and the sentence that he has been given. So the representation that Khanya got was poor. But we are saying that there should have been alternatives as opposed to time behind bars that should have been explored for Khanya.
Matteo Brody, what poor legal advice, in your opinion, was he given?
Well, one, we know that he pled guilty when what we understand that he shouldn't have pled guilty to the charge. And so...
Do you know why he did that?
I can't comment on that, on those specifics, but it is said to have been because of the poor legal advice that he received. But two...
So if we speculate, because this is important, if we speculate, possibly there was a promise of some sort of plea bargain, perhaps, which was either failed to be communicated to him, or there was a problem between his legal team and the prosecution.
Possibly. I can't comment on those dynamics. But the second issue is that even in terms of the sentence that Khanya got, there was no appeal by his legal representation who was from legal aid. And so the whole process for him, I think, was unjust and unfair.
Are you in touch with him as an organization?
we are in touch with his family, and in fact we met with his family today, and following from the president's announcement yesterday, I know the family, and we are also hopeful that Khanya will be out for by Christmas to spend time with his family.
Are you basing that just on the president's announcement, or is there more information that you have either gleaned from legal sources or from the family themselves?
Well, according to
what leads to the optimism, in other words?
Well, according to the announcement by the president, Khanya is immediately eligible for parole. And so, you know, given that he's immediately eligible for parole, one hopes that a parole board would sit soon and he will be granted parole.
As we understand this process, and there are thousands of prisoners involved in this, this could take many months. I'm hearing until possibly May next year. So you're hoping this happens sooner rather than later. What has the family been saying to you?
Well, the family is very hopeful. As you'll know, Khanya has suffered a lot, as anyone would suffer behind bars. And someone as young and, you know, who was so eager to continue with his studies. So it has taken a real knock on his own mental health. And so the family really wants to get Khanya out and, you know, back into society.
In what way has it impacted on his mental health? What are they saying? Because, again, that's a disturbing conclusion.
Yeah. Well, for one, a few weeks ago, if not a week ago, Khanya had a mental breakdown in prison, and he had to be transported out of prison and taken to another health institution to be assessed and to be stabilized. So, you know, the conditions in prison are obviously and evidently taking a knock on his mental health.
I think that is a very fair conclusion. Again, I understand that you're simply an intermediary. You have spoken to the family. We're not talking to the family directly. But what are they doing as a result of the mental breakdown, for instance? How have they taken this forward?
Well, I mean, what can be done? You know, they continue to provide support to Khanya. They visit Khanya, and you know, a lot of the hopes have been based on the appeal that's going to happen. I'm informed early next year on his conviction, and so, you know, this new parole announcement brings new added hope.
So there's the possibility of a remission, but we also remember, I think it was last month, when the Justice Minister also said his department was assisting in a possible presidential pardon. So there would be two streams operating here. What have you heard in terms of the presidential pardon?
Well, we haven't heard anything in terms of a presidential pardon. There's been no movement. We're aware that the minister did make some comments, but since those comments were made, there's been nothing that's been communicated to anyone about the presidential pardon.
So Section 27 and a number of other organizations are now banding together, yes, I understand, to apply more pressure.
Yeah.
Where are you applying that pressure, and what resistance, if any, are you meeting?
Well, one, we think, you know, when Khanya applies for bail, as he did in this appeal, the state shouldn't counter that application for bail. Because Khanya has not had any incidents while he's been behind bars. He's been very well behaved. In fact, we're told that all the wardens at the correctional facility are very like him very much, because he's a well-behaved person, and that's how he has been even before he went into behind bars. So, you know, that's the type of person that he is, and we are making the appeal that he should be let out.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. From the organisation, the NGO Section 27, Moteo Brody, thank you for joining us at South Africa Tonight.